Hello and welcome to Jaded Law channel. This is a law-based channel where your legal needs are met, questions answered, and issues resolved again. I remain your host, Mrs. Omango Obi. Today, I'll be talking about a very important topic, and I consider this topic very important because it affects everyone. This topic borders on shelter, borders on accommodation, and we know that everyone is either a landlord, a tenant, or both a landlord and a tenant. So maybe you own your own home, or you have your business run in a rented apartment, or whatever. This topic is very, very, very important and very relevant for you. Today, I would streamline this to the relationship between a landlord and his tenant, and particularly on the rights of a tenant. I have often been confronted with the question as to whether tenants have rights. Do tenants have rights? And if they do, can these rights be enforced? So let me begin by stating that the relationship between a landlord and his tenant is contractual in nature. What this simply means is that the relationship is based on a contract, an agreement between the parties. Contracts can be written, they can be oral, or they can be partly oral and written. So in circumstances where, for instance, the relationship between the landlord and his tenants is based on a written contract, then we have more than 90% of the issues resolved. The reason being that most or all of the terms and the conditions by which they intend to be bound should have been stated in the tenancy agreement, a well drawn up tenancy agreement. So you find a tenancy agreement, for instance, that contains clauses as to the rent, payment of rents, when should rents be paid, how they should be paid, what the property is for, is it for residential or for commercial, whatever, and the tenant does not have a right, it would stipulate that tenant does not have a right to part with possession or sublet the property without the written consent of the landlord. You find clauses that have to do with the tenant not making alterations to the property without the written consent of the landlord. These and many more provisions and clauses you'll find in a well drawn up tenancy agreement that leaves no room for doubt as to what the parties intend to be bound by. Difficulties would seem therefore to arise where the relationship is simply oral. So a person who's interested in the property meets with the owner of the property, he pays, the owner gives him the keys, he moves in. What are the terms? Is there a contract between the parties? The answer to that is yes, there's still a contract between the parties. Now the law comes to play, and the law implies that that tenant has a right to a quiet and peaceable enjoyment of the property that he's paid for. Included in this right is the right to privacy. So the tenant has a right to privacy. The landlord cannot just barge into the tenant's apartment at will. The tenant also does have right to exclusive possession of the place that he is paid for. So if the landlord, for instance, lives in the same premises with the tenant, he cannot, for instance, ask one of his relatives to go and stay with the tenant because there's a tenant. I've seen one of such situations before. The tenant does have exclusive possession to the premises that he is paid for, and the tenant should not be disturbed. Freedom from unreasonable disturbance. The tenant also should have access to common areas so long as it is for lawful and reasonable purpose. So you find situations where you have secluded areas in a premises where maybe you have the pumping machine or the well just to ensure that the facilities are secured. The tenant should have right to those places so long as they are for lawful and reasonable purposes. Having said that, I could almost feel tenants jubilating and saying, oh, we have rights and all that. That is fantastic, but attached to every right are obligations. So you cannot begin to insist on your right as a tenant when you have failed to fulfill your obligations. I'm not saying by that the landlord now has the right to act the way he likes. No, but I'm saying that the one who comes to equity must do equity, and the one who comes to equity must come with clean hands. So before you begin to insist on those rights, ensure that the obligations that you have as a tenant are fulfilled. What are these obligations? The first obligation that you have towards your landlord is to ensure that rents are paid promptly. Now, rents ought to be paid in advance and not in arrears. That is one of the obligations that you have as a tenant. The other obligation is to ensure that the property is kept in a proper state. The property should be well maintained. That is an obligation for the tenant. Again, the tenant must ensure he does not sublet the property or part with it without informing the landlord. The tenant must ensure that he does not sublet or part with possession of the property without informing the landlord. And whenever it discovers that there are structural damage to the property, he must promptly inform the landlord to enable the landlord effect the necessary repairs. Having said this, there are times where the tenant has done everything that he knows to do to maintain the property, to ensure that he does everything within his power to make the relationship work, and the landlord, for one reason or the other, just decides that this tenant has to vacate. What happens in such circumstances? Does the landlord have the right to throw out the tenant's belongings? Does he have that right to resort to self-help? Now, this would take us to the next episode as to the rights of the tenant to be served with the appropriate length of statutory notices. I hope you found this video very helpful. I would want to urge you to get your friends, your family members, and your colleagues to subscribe to this channel. And if you like the content, do encourage us. Just tap on the like button. Let's have your comments in the comment section so that we would be able to know how best to meet your legal needs. Again, ignorance of the law is no excuse. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Stay blessed.